Hello, everyone. This journey is going to be a little bit different. We're going to travel down a winding road to different places and different times. Now, you can see and figure out how this is going to end. But we don't know how this is going to end. I always wondered why we keep having these wars, why we just can't figure out things and get along. So, to give you a little bit of a background on my way of thinking, I'll talk a little bit about my younger days. As you probably know, Switzerland has a militia system, whereas every male, and now females don't have to, but they can join, between 19 and 34 year age have to join the military. And the other thing that is you sign up or you get conscription notice usually when you're 18 years old. But once you're in the military, you're able to take your uniform and your weapons home. So basically every household has a rifle. Now once a year you have to go for inspection, where you take your gear and you go to a designated place and they inspect it. Well, my dad, he thought that we would make fine helpers. So whenever the day came up that we had to go for inspection, the night before he brought the rifle out, brought all his gear out, and he put us to work. We took the rifle apart, cleaned the barrel, lubricated everything, made sure everything worked fine. And I must say, I think every woman in Switzerland must hate that day, because when they went off for inspection, we never saw our dad until maybe next day, sometimes 2 days later. And I've heard of guys that never came back for a whole week. So anyway, when I was just about to turn 18, I had signed up before. I thought, well, I'll want to join the military, because one thing that everybody always says, well, once you did your boot camp, everybody shows you respect, because then you're a man. And it kind of reminded me of a situation that happened to me when I was I guess it was maybe 16, 17, and I had my moped, and there's a fella in town that had a gas station. Of course, it was not full service back then, and he was a bicycle repairer and motorcycle repairer. Actually, he had a dealership for a BMW motorcycle, but small town operation. So anyway, I went in there one Saturday afternoon and to get some gas. I rang the bell and he came out of the house and he says, "Hello, Mr. Widmer." And I thought, why is he calling me Mr. Widmer? I turned around and looked behind me, because I thought my dad must be standing behind me. And he just started smiling and says, No, you're not working, and you joined the men, so from now on I'll call you Mr. Widmer. And I thought, wow. I was put my chest out a little more and stood a little straighter and says, oh, this, now I get respect. So anyway, day came when you have to go in for, I guess it's when you have to go in for the basic test where they make sure you qualify for the military, or also they assess you to whether you are fit and what level of action you're going to be performing in the military. Now, at the time, I had some serious back issues, and so I was some of the things I had a hard time running. But anyway, so I still had to go in, and so they could qualify me. So I had to be there. I think it was 9 o'clock. So I jumped on my moped and head over to the next town to the location. I get halfway there and it says, "Oh man, I forgot my booklet," because there's a booklet you have to have that every soldier gets, which basically records all your activities and what you've been doing while in the military, but also has a description of what you're qualified for. So I made a U-turn, went back home, got the booklet, and so I get to the location, probably 5 minutes late, and I rushed in, and this guy standing at the door, he gives me the look and he says, "You're late. You're 5 minutes late, and you're now under military law, and you better just go in there and apologize to the commanding officer, and for whatever you're told, you do. No questions asked." Well, that was the moment that everything changed for me, because I suddenly realized when you join the military, it's not a game. You know, as a kid, you polish the rifle and that goes off, has a good time, but it was a totally different ball game. So anyway, we had to examine. Well, they had to do some testing, whatever you could do. I had climbing, and I could toss a stone, and so there was certain things I could do and certain things I couldn't do. And there was also a rather thorough medical inspection, your eyes, your ears, and everything else. And what I thought was a bit odd. Well, odd was in a way I thought was kind of funny. So you had like between 15, 20 guys standing there in a row, and then the commanding officer yells, "Okay, drop your drawers and bend over." Well, all I could think of was a little rhyme that we learned in kindergarten, and it goes like this: Alle Entlein schwimmen auf dem See, Köpflein in dem Wasser und Schwänzlein in die Höhe. Meaning that all the ducks are swimming on the lake, head in the water and tail in the air. Well, you can see that I was assigned Hilfsdienst, which is basically I still have to wear a uniform, got to go in, but I wouldn't be active duty because at that particular point in time I was unfit to do actually hard military service. And as it turned out, in our family, only Paul ended up serving. And my oldest brother, Carl, he got to be a priest, but I think I'm not sure if they drafted him to be a chaplain, but nonetheless, he didn't really go, and I never seen him carrying a uniform or wearing uniform or carrying a gun. So, and now, of course, the military, there's still better uniforms, better weapons. Well, I think it was before the First World War, Kaiser Wilhelm was the king of Germany at the time. He came on an official visit into Switzerland. Well, he was king from 1888 to 1918, but so anyway, he of course, when you have those official visits, everybody salutes and they got the official guards, soldiers lining up. So then Kaiser Wilhelm says to the Swiss official there, and he says, well, I know you got some pretty healthy looking soldiers, but Germany, we got twice as many troops. Well, the Swiss guy just kind of stared at him, took a deep breath, and he said, well, I guess we have to shoot twice. As it turns out, I never served in the military because I left first to go to Holland and then to Canada. And so 2 years later, I was in Toronto, and I started working for these two fellows, was Eric Kramer and Art. Eric and Art ended up splitting up, and I guess they decided I would stay with Eric Kramer, and Art went on his own way. And Kramer was a bit of a interesting character, as I sort of later found out. It's interesting how sometimes people open up when you're sitting there having lunch. One day he was telling me that he couldn't sleep in the same bed with his wife because he had these recurring nightmares from the war, and he was always kicking like a mule, and of course that was not conducive for peaceful sleep for his wife. Because as it turns out, he was actually, during the war, the German had hired him, drafted him to be a spy. So he was traveling throughout Russia and Eastern Europe under a Swiss passport, pretending he was a businessman, buying and selling things. And so on one of his winter trips, I guess he got stuck somewhere and he froze off his toes, and there was his sacrifice to the war, I suppose. Well, he was also a bit of I call him a smooth operator, because he actually never worked too much. He would get supplies, and he was disappearing most days, and he would come back telling me stories, and turns out he was kind of chummy with a lot of the hockey players in the Maple Leaf team, and he also got to know Alan Eagleson. Of course, Eagleson had a bad reputation, and he also got to know Harriet Foster, who was a radio announcer on CBC, and he also had started Foster Advertising. Well, Harry Foster hired Kramer to build a stone wall in front of his office down on St. Clair Street West. And so I was down there building this stone wall, and I guess he liked the work, because then he asked if he could build a fountain at his house. He had a fairly large estate in Mississauga. So I ended up doing the stonework on that fountain, but I had no clue on how to do the plumbing. Well, that's how I met Harry Stein. And Harry Stein was a fountain expert, and he'd all set up the pumps and the plumbing, etc., etc. Well, while he was working there, I noticed he had numbers tattooed on his arm. So I didn't ask anything. I just thought overnight, well, I wonder what it is. So I thought, I'll ask him next day. So I next day asked him, well, what's the story behind that? And he was just kind of looked me up and down. He said, well, he was Jewish, and he had been on the Hunger March during the Second War, and he ended up in a prison camp. But he survived the war. But he was telling me how they had a cart with bread on it, and they would pull that in front of the people, and at the end of the day, if you survived the day, you got to eat some bread. But he was a very quiet man, and that's the only thing he ever told me, and he didn't want to talk about the war. I don't blame the man. But I did end up helping him out once in a while with some of the fountains. With the same group of fellows, I also met Martin Bertelsen, who lived in Wildrick Road. He was a landscaper, and he asked me one day if I could look after his house during the winter, because he was going to go to Latvia. That's where he was from. And so I said, oh, no problem. Anyway, we got together, and he kind of told me the story, what happened to him. When the Germans invaded Latvia, I guess he was a young lad, and so the Germans put him in a Nazi uniform, and I'm not sure exactly how long and exactly what transpired while he was in uniform. However, when the Russians invaded and kicked the Germans out, he knew that his days were counted. So he left his wife, and he had a small boy, and he went to Canada. And on the ship, he met another woman. He ended up marrying her because he knew that the Russians would send his wife and son to Siberia, and he figured at 99% he would never see them again. But after about 20 years, his second wife passed away, and he started contacting relatives back in Latvia, and it turns out that his wife had not been in Siberia very long, and so she had been back in Riga, and her son had come back as well, and he actually got a degree as an engineer. So then he got in touch with her, and somehow they clicked again. So he wanted to bring her back to Canada. Well, the Soviets didn't think too much of that, so he ended up having to, well, first of all, they wouldn't let her go until she was retirement age, and he actually had to pay for her to get her released. So she came to Canada, and unfortunately, after about 1 year, I think a year and a half, when she was in Canada, Martin had a heart attack. But there's a strong Latvian community, and they all took care of his wife. His son never came to Canada, but I guess he had a good job in Russia. One thing that was interesting with Martin, we also ended up doing a few projects together, and we meet on the weekends to do some estimates. And he had always his abacus thing. And I don't know how he worked that thing, but he would just slide this little balls back and forth and figure things out. And you just write down some numbers and you ramble on in Latvian. But it seemed to work for him. Well, and then there was Duncan. Duncan was a tall, slim Scottish fellow. And he was had a little company doing landscape maintenance, cutting grass and planting flowers. But he was kind of a funny lad because he would always come up really close. His face would be always 6 inches from you, and he would, of course, it was always hard to understand him too. He still had this thick Scottish accent. But he was telling me one day that he was actually, during the war, a pilot in Lancaster, flying over Germany and France. And he was shot down twice, survived both shutdowns, and one time he said the bullet came up through and almost just came between him and his co-pilot through the floor up into the ceiling. So he had a few close calls, but he was still positive and cheerful. Now, as a landscaper in Canada, there isn't a heck of a lot you can do January and February, depending on how March is. But so one of the things you end up doing is just walk to the mall. So he would hang out at Hillcrest Mall. It's a new mall. And one day he just sat in one of those chairs and went to sleep and never woke up. What a peaceful way to go after that struggle. Now, not every story starts with a war. Sometimes people are on the move because of oppressive regimes. So I met this painter who originally came from Hungary. So he was telling me that when he was 15, his parents sent him to Canada by himself. And I think what happened was he had an aunt that lived in New York, and she was able to provide him with some money and probably bought the tickets for the train and the boat. So anyway, he ended up in Paris. He was telling me sitting by the fountain and just crying because he didn't know where to go, couldn't talk French, didn't know what to do. And he had this couple walking by the fountain and they're speaking Hungarian. So he quickly jumped up and started talking to them. And he told them his dilemma that, he had to catch a ship, didn't know how to get to Le Havre, he had to take it, but clueless. Well, it so happened that they were actually heading out to Canada on the same boat. So that was kind of lucky. So he got on the ship, ended up in Canada, took the train all the way to Manitoba. That's where a relative had a farm, and he said, okay, you can come live with him. Well, turned out that wasn't exactly a place of happiness because that guy treated him worse than a dog. So he wrote a letter to his aunt in New York and says, well, I have no money. Guy doesn't let me get out the farmer. All I have to do is work, no school. So she sent him some money. And of course, the letter went to his relative. And so that son of a gun, he kept the money, but he put him on a freight train. So here's a train going to Montreal, and off he went. And you can imagine, well, at that point, maybe he was 17, probably spoke some English, at least he was able to figure things out. So he finally ends up in Montreal. There's a fairly strong Hungarian community, and they one of the fellows says, "Oh, I can find you a job." So he got to work with this fellow that specializes in painting churches. Now, I never realized this, but a lot of the pillars that you see in churches or in museums, and they're actually not marble, even though they look like marble, they're actually been painted. So he learned to do all this very delicate work, and he got to be quite good at it. Well, he also joined the Hungarian soccer team in Montreal, and one day things got a bit rough, and he got hurt. He ended up in the hospital, and while he was in the hospital, he met this nurse. Well, make a long story short, they got along and eventually got married, and then they moved to Toronto, and he started a business there, painting houses, and they had a family, and so there was a happy ending to that. So I understand why the lion kills, but why do we humans kill each other? I guess there's a lot of reasons, a lot of excuses. It reminds me of a story I read a few years ago. There was this family that went back to visit relatives in former Yugoslavia. And while they were there, one of the nephews, little kiddo, came home crying. I says, "What's the matter?" He says, "Well, the class is putting on a play, and I'm not allowed to be in the play. So why not?" "Well, the teacher said because your grandfather was a Nazi sympathizer." And that, I think, is part of the problem. I think people need to be compassionate and have some forgiveness. How can you blame a child for what the grandfather did? One of Zelensky's advisors said that all wars end at the negotiating table, which probably was a very wise observation. Look through history. That's how it usually ends. Well, we now know of all the consequences of war. Unfortunately, it is happening again in the Ukraine. Stories are written again. Fathers, husbands, and sons are lost. Ukrainians and Russians, aggressors and defenders. And most likely, 30 to 40 years from now, some Russian from Moscow will travel to Odessa for vacation at the beach. He will explain to the locals how happy he is to share the sun and the ice cream with him. Just look around the parking lot at your local grocery store and you see lots of Japanese and German cars. The pain's forgotten and the damage repaired. Well, how do we stop this cycle? In a democracy, it starts with the elections. Choose well. Look behind the curtains of the candidates. Will he or she hold up justice? Be compassionate and honest. Use your right to vote as it is one of the tools of peace. I also like to think that the United Nations is working hard for the oppressed and disenfranchised and disadvantaged. I know it sometimes is a little cynical and to see what's happening at the United Nations. And I think also what needs to stop is the veto powers of some of the biggest offenders to peace. Well, let's hope for best, and we'll see you another time.